Okay, let's start at the top here. The first verse of the Gospel of Mark says, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God. And as we will see in its fullness, here you go, Dad. By the time we get to the end of the book, we'll appreciate, hopefully, how that one simple statement is an outline of the book. But maybe more importantly, this is kind of the heart of Mark's message, that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is the Son of God. In this rendering here of the structure of Mark, we've basically just cut the book in half, part 1 and part 2, and 2 questions that Mark is answering in his gospel. In chapters 1 to 8, what is the question that we've said Mark is answering? Who is Jesus? Thank you, Terry. And I meant for the other stuff to come up as I clicked through, but remember that this portion begins with a declaration. God, in a sense, is answering the question, who is Jesus, speaking at his baptism from the heavens. You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased. Okay? And then throughout those 8 chapters, Jesus is demonstrating who he is through his miracles, through his casting out of demons. Remember that the word authority is used quite a bit, especially in relation to his teaching. And we see Jesus, through those miracles, demonstrating his authority and his power over the various elements, spiritual and physical, we might say. And so, the people are all reacting to Jesus differently. Some are upset, some are curious, some are amazed, but generally the question in Mark 1 to 8 is, who is this guy? Who is Jesus? And we come to the end of the first half of the book of Mark, and Jesus is alone with his apostles, and he asks them, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ. Okay, he says, you are the Christ, which is the first of the 2 statements made about Jesus in Mark's outline, in his summary statement in Mark chapter 1 and verse 1. And so at that moment, then we move on to the second half of the book of Mark, in which Mark is answering which question? What question? Do you remember? This is a little bit newer, so. Yeah, why did he come? Thank you, Michelle. We know he's the Christ, or at least the apostles do. And if you remember, right after declaring that Jesus is the Christ, Peter has a misstep because Jesus starts talking about how he's going to suffer, how he's going to die, and Peter says, no, that's not what it means to be the Christ. And so the second half of the book, Jesus is answering, Mark is answering the question, why did the Messiah come? And that second half is kind of kicked off with a very similar incident to the baptism, the transfiguration, in which God again will speak from heaven and say, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. But the second half of the book of Mark is different in its content from the first half. Jesus 3 times is talking about the suffering that he will face in Jerusalem, how he will be killed by the Jewish leaders. There's a lot of teaching, not so many parables like the first half, but teaching instead on sacrifice and discipleship and giving up what you have and becoming like children and leaving everything to follow him. These are the kinds of teachings that Jesus is engaged in the second half of the book of Mark. And then all of this is kind of culminating as he gets closer to Jerusalem and then finally enters into Jerusalem. And as we are here in chapter 11, 12, 13, last week and this week, he is confronting the religious establishment in Jerusalem, and then you know what that's going to lead to, but still we'll leave it open-ended, just not to spoil the ending of the book of Mark. We'll see where the rest of this goes. So that's kind of Mark in 2 halves. Who is Jesus, and why did he come? And we're working through that second half right now. Remember, I also told you that you could think of Mark in 3 acts, okay? Same basic summary statement in chapter 1 and verse 1. You could think of Act 1 as the same thing, basically. Chapters 1 to 8, who is Jesus? You could see chapters 8 to 10 as a transitional section. Act 2, in which Jesus is answering the question, well, what does that mean that he is the Messiah? Where he's talking about his suffering, he's teaching on sacrifice. And then you could see a third act where Jesus in chapter 11 comes into Jerusalem, and we have kind of the climactic moment in which he is becoming king through the events that happen in the final days of his life. Remember, chapter 11, the triumphal entry to the end of the book, is just 1 week. So we're very focused in here on the final events of the life of Jesus. So you can think about the book that way as well. But let's go in our Bibles to Mark chapter 11 and 12, just to review, and then we'll read and talk about Mark chapter 13 tonight. These are the episodes that we talked about last week in Mark 11 and 12. Coming into Jerusalem, the cleansing of the temple in chapter 11. We have discussions, arguments with the Jewish leaders about the authority of Jesus. Jesus tells a parable about them being vine growers that are rejecting the vineyard owner. The questions about taxes and about the resurrection. Discussion about the greatest commandment. And then a warning at the end of chapter 12 about the scribes and their desire to look a certain way while they are oppressing others. And then perhaps an example of that oppression at the end of chapter 12 and the widow who is down to her last 2 mites. So, we talked about this last week, but let's bring it back to the forefront here. What is the pattern in these stories? What are the themes that run through chapter 11 and 12 from last week? What do you see now? What do you remember? What were the big themes from 11 and 12 last week? What's happening in these chapters? Okay, rebuking and teaching the Jewish leaders, along with the other teaching going on. Thank you, Albert. And I think that's the first one on here. Okay, he's rebuking them and really exposing them for their wickedness, for their hypocrisy, and so on. And as Jesus is rebuking them, what is their response to Jesus? Yeah, by what authority, right? And so we are seeing the kind of growing rejection of Jesus. Remember, you can think of this section as Jesus versus Jerusalem. And so we see the clashing, the conflict just increasing all the more as Jesus is more direct in some ways about his rebukes, and they are now going to be more kind of intentional about their threats and their desire to have him killed. That's the context into which we come to chapter 13. Chapter 13 is a little bit of a difficult chapter, I think, in the book of Mark, but I'm not worried about how y'all will handle it. Y'all will do great. As we read the text, and we are going to read it, this is just the one chapter, I want you to think about a few things as we go. One, there's a reason we kind of started by reminding ourselves of chapter 11 and 12. Think about chapter 13 in light of what's been going on as Jesus has come into Jerusalem in the last 2 chapters. So how does this fit with the last 2 chapters? Think about this as a conversation. We're going to see that it is a conversation, okay? And don't miss that. How does this conversation start? What is the question that Jesus has asked as the conversation moves forward? And then what is Jesus' answer? And that'll take up most of the chapter, but be thinking about the conversation as it began in the first few verses and what it is that Jesus has asked and how he is addressing that particular question. Let's read together. Mark chapter 13, starting in verse 1. We'll read all the way down to the end. And as he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon the other which will not be torn down." And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew were questioning him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled?" Verse 5, and Jesus began to say to them, "See to it that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and will mislead many. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Those things must take place. That is not yet the end. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be earthquakes in various places, and there will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of birth pains. But see to yourselves, for they will deliver you to the courts, and you will be beaten in the synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake as a witness to them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all the nations. And when they lead you away, delivering you up, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Holy Spirit. And brother will betray brother to death, and father his child, and children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. Verse 14 of Mark 13. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and the one who is on the housetop must not go down or go in to get anything out of the house, and the one who is in the field must not turn back to get his garment. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, but pray that it might not happen in the winter. For those days will be a time of tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the creation, which God created until now and never will. And unless the Lord had shortened those days, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or behold, here he is there, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show signs and wonders in order to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But as for you, see, I have told you everything in advance. Verse 24, but in those days after the great tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send forth the angels, and will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When the branch has already become tender and put forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Even so, you too, when you see these things happening, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. See to it, keep on the alert, for you do not know when the appointed time will come. It is like a man away on a journey, who, leaving his house and giving authority to his slaves, each one his task, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening, at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. Okay, I'm going to turn you loose to talk about this amongst yourselves for a little bit, but first, let's answer like the middle two questions here, okay? There's a conversation that starts here with Jesus and his disciples. How does it start? Going all the way back to the beginning of the chapter here. How does the conversation start here in Mark 13? Yeah, what are they doing? What are the disciples doing? Admiring the beautiful temple, okay? And what does Jesus say about that? Everything will be torn down, town down. There you go. Everything will be town down. And then there's a little bit of a break because the disciples go up on the Mount of Olives. But then what is the question that Jesus has asked? Yeah, when is this all going to take place? What do you think they're referring to when they say, when is all this going to take place? The destruction of Jerusalem. That's what Jesus had just told them was going to happen. When will these things, that is, the destruction of Jerusalem, of the temple you just told us about, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? So as Brian alluded to, I think there's two questions here. When will this destruction of the temple happen? And then what will be the sign when these things are going to take place? Okay, so this is the question that then launches Jesus into the rest of what he says in chapter 13. So it seems to me like the rest of Mark 13 should be seen as an answer to this specific question about when will the temple be destroyed. Okay, now I leave it to you. What is Jesus' answer? There's more than one answer he gives. There's multiple facets to his answer. But talk amongst yourselves and try to keep this as simple as you can. I'm trying to ask this question in a more simple and direct way. You don't need to talk about all the confusing things in the chapter, but just limit it to this. The question is, when are these things going to happen, and what are the signs? And so what does Jesus answer to that question? Spend a minute here. We'll do this 60 seconds, and just look at the text, think to yourself, And then when I say go, you can talk with those next to you and you can share ideas and collaborate. But 1 minute, just look at the text yourself and think, what is Jesus' answer in this chapter to the two questions that he's been asked? Okay. What do you got? We do have some microphones that are going to be going around, but share it out. What did you talk about in your groups? What answers, conclusions did you come to? What is Jesus' answer to when will these things happen? What will be the sign of their going to be fulfilled? Harrison said that the sign seems to be the abomination of desolation. Melanie said the same thing, and the obvious response is, well, now it's all so clear. It's just that made it all make sense. The sign is look for the abomination of desolation. Got it, Jesus. We're good to go. No more explanation needed, right? Let's get Brian, and then Marty was going to jump in, I think.
Jesus answers with two epical prophecies foretelling two destructions. One, the destruction of Jerusalem, for which the when and the signs being a pointing towards when, and at the conclusion he's saying, when you see these signs, flee, save yourself. And then somewhere around 24, he switches over to the destruction of the world, of which there are no signs, and no one knows when, and therefore he says, be prepared. And then there's an interlude, as Larson pointed out, at around 29, 30, 31. He seems to revert back to this destruction of Jerusalem. But it appears also that perhaps the destruction of Jerusalem is a foretelling or prophetic figure of the end of the world.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Dad, you have something?
Just simply, the first few verses are all about things that seem to be before this event. So to answer the question when, part of the answer is after some things, after the spread of the gospel, after some period of persecution, after some false Christs have arisen, after some worldwide events, wars and famines and earthquakes. So that's pretty clear in that section. He's saying these things will happen first, and then it's after that, and then the specific sign, abomination, desolation.
Okay, thank you. Other thoughts, other things that came up in your group? Answers to when is this going to happen? What are the signs? All kinds of bad things, Dan says. Right? Okay, where is that, Michelle? Where did you find that? Verse 30, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So all these things are going to happen within the lifespan of this generation. Thank you, Michelle. Other things you want to throw in? Right?
In the lifetime of this generation, clearly he says also that the gospel's got to be preached to the entire world. So we know that the gospel has yet to be preached to the entire world and to all peoples. And therefore, it appears to me that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple will happen in the lifespan of that particular generation, but not the end of the world, which obviously still exists 2,000 years later.
Okay. Other things you want to get in before we synthesize some of this and look more closely? Yes, Rick.
Just one other additional thought. So that language that we see there in verses 24 through 27, in the Old Testament, that would refer to the fall of a nation. And so this whole thing could be tied back to fall of the temple, the fall of the nation of the Jews, and it all wraps up to be contained within that one phrase. Everything will be seen by this generation, basically. So I've heard that before as well. The confusing part is going to be when he talks about gathering his elect. That's where my confusion comes in. Other than that, I can wrap that
There's
around.
confusion in this chapter, Rick?
Maybe a little, but the rest of that you can see being completed in the destruction of the Jewish nation and the temple, except for that part about his elect being gathered. That's where I'm having trouble.
Okay. Thank you, Rick. Okay, so we got a lot here, right? We have this description of a lot of bad things that are going to happen, kind of general bad things. Dan alluded to that. We have, as Harrison mentioned right off the bat, there does seem to be a specific sign called the abomination of desolation. Okay, so we have that as a sign of when these things are going to happen. We have, in some ways, kind of multiple answers being given by Jesus. Brian alluded to this. There are times when he seems to be saying, this is when it's going to happen, or maybe not that, but at least these are the signs you can be looking for, okay? And then he seems to be saying in other places, we don't know when it's going to happen, okay? There are things that indicate that it's going to happen, like he says, within the generation of the listeners, as Michelle pointed out. And then there's also things here that seem like they're going to be a long time taking place. The main, I think, message in some ways was repeated by several of you, which is there's a sense of awakeness and preparedness that Jesus is stressing towards the end. So that factors in somehow as well. Okay, let's go through and a little more closely. We have the opportunity in this class to look a little more closely at the text than we have in other classes, which was intentional because I'm not going to answer all your questions, absolutely, but we can at least look a little more closely at what is a more difficult chapter. Okay, so verses 1 to 4, we have the setup. Temple's going to be destroyed. Question is when and what are the signs? So Jesus answers. Here's how I would break down this chapter. And of course, there is room to disagree with me. That's fine. Verses 5 to 13, I call these the non-signs. That is, he describes some things that are going to happen, but they're not really signs of anything special taking place. Okay? Why do I say that? Well, look at verse 7, for instance. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. Verse 8, for nation will rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of the birth pains. Okay? So I see these events here as this is just life, right? That's one of the things that I was saying to Fidencio earlier, is that one thing here is that these things, earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars, when has there been a period of history in which these things were not happening? Okay? These are not signs of anything special happening in human history necessarily. They're just things that happen. And notice that the turn in verse 9, Jesus says, but see to yourselves, okay? Don't get caught up in the crises of this world, okay? That's just going to happen. That's the beginning of the birth pains, he says, okay? Instead, see to yourselves, because, as was mentioned earlier, you're going to be, to preach the gospel, you're going to be put on trial, and you need to be ready to stand up for the truth, verses 9 to 13. And so worry about that. Worry about standing up for the truth and not all these things going on. Sorry, I am not clicking here. In the midst of all this, people will try to deceive. They'll try to say, I'm the Christ, or lead people astray, verse 6. Okay? And so Jesus says, see that no one deceives you. Your job, he says to his disciples, is to preach the gospel and endure to the end. So 5 to 13 I see as non-signs. Okay, get that out of the way. These things are going to happen. They are not signs of the end. Okay? Now, just briefly, because Brian brought it up, my understanding is that when Jesus says the gospel in verse 9, verse 10 must be first proclaimed to all nations, I think that's basically like a figure of speech. It's going to go really far, right? Not literally to every nation that's ever going to exist in history, but just it's going to go to all nations. It's going to start with the Jews, go to Gentiles, and go to the ends of the known world at that time, thus essentially fulfilling what Jesus says there, the gospel going to all the nations, okay? Get to verse 14, and we have this abomination of desolation that is mentioned. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, okay? Whatever it is, Jesus says, when you see it, get out immediately. Verse 14. Those who are in Judea, flee when you see the abomination of desolation, right? The AOD, okay? You see that, you get out, you're on your housetop, you're in the field, you get out of town. Get out of Jerusalem, get out of Judea. That is the sign, Jesus says, will trigger, the need to flee Jerusalem. Okay. If we had more time, we could go to the book of Daniel. We could see that abomination of desolation is used in Daniel. We could talk about all of that. But there's a much easier and quicker way to do this, which is to cross-reference to the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus says in Luke 21:20, in the same conversation, instead of saying, when you see the abomination of desolation, Jesus says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Okay? A lot easier to understand there. Okay? Why does Luke say that and Matthew and Mark say the other? I don't know. Okay? But I think basically these are saying the same thing. Okay? The abomination of desolation is this pagan force, right? This pagan army that is going to show up on the doorstep and surround the holy city. That's the abomination of desolation, or the abomination that makes desolate. Okay, Luke says when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So I think we can plug that in here to Mark, and that is the sign. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, get out of town. He says it's going to be a horrible, unprecedented type of tribulation. Okay, again, I think Jesus is using a figure of speech in verse 19 when he says those days will be a time of tribulation such has not occurred since the beginning of creation, which God created until now and never will. It's never been this bad before. It's never be this bad since. Okay, I don't think that's a literal statement. Okay, there are times in the Old Testament, by the way, that I'm talking about a king and say he's the worst king Israel ever had or would ever have, and then you have another king that's called the worst king that Israel ever had or will ever have. Okay. And so the Bible sometimes uses that kind of exaggerated language, and Jesus seems to be doing that here. It's going to be a really bad tribulation, okay? And again, there are going to be, notice verse 21, false promises. People saying, here's the Christ, okay? So the armies surround Jerusalem. There are going to be people saying, hey, I'm the deliverer. I can bail us out of this. Jesus says, don't believe that for a second. Instead, get out of town. Verse 23, he's really trying to clarify this. As for you, see, I have told you everything in advance. Jesus is preparing them for this, so don't be deceived by the false promises of deliverance. Okay? That's through verse 23 here. Get some water. Verse 24, that was mentioned as kind of maybe a even more difficult section here. Verse 24 begins, in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. He will send forth the angels, will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest ends of the earth to the farthest end of heaven. Okay? Your Bible maybe it does what mine does, which is has some way of indicating that these are quotations from Old Testament scriptures. Okay, and that is helpful. Okay, but we need to understand why it's helpful. Jesus is using language from prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, not because those prophets were foretelling what's going to happen here, but because he is using or saying a similar message, giving a similar message to the people of Jerusalem as the prophets gave to the people that they were speaking to. For instance, you jot this down and go back and look at it. Remember, all the PowerPoints are always online afterward. You can go look up the verses. Isaiah 13 verse 10 uses this same language of the sun's going to be made dark, the moon and stars will not give their light. Okay, this kind of cosmic, bodies falling in, into the world type language, we think. Okay, but you go back and look at Isaiah 13 verse 1, and it says this is an oracle against Babylon. Okay, this is just a judgment. I say just a judgment. It's a big deal, and that's maybe one helpful thing to remember. We say it sounds like the end of the world. Well, guess what? When the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, it was the end of their world. Okay, everything, not just physically, but think about everything they put their confidence in, everything they had hoped for, everything. The temple was the temple. To have all that burned up and destroyed and Jerusalem run, roughshod over by the Romans, that is the end of their world, essentially. Same thing for Babylon, when Babylon the Great falls. So the prophets use this exaggerated poetic language to describe God's judgment. Isaiah did it for Babylon, and Jesus is using that same language to talk about Jerusalem. Well, what about the Son of Man coming in verse 26? Doesn't that mean that's Jesus' return and the end of the world? I don't think so. Again, you see that there's a quotation here drawing from Daniel chapter 7. And Daniel chapter 7 describes the Son of Man coming, but it's not about the Son of Man coming to the earth. It's about the Son of Man coming into heaven, into his reigning over all nations. Okay? And I think that is the sense in which the Son of Man is coming here in Mark chapter 13, describing the destruction of Jerusalem. That when Jerusalem is destroyed, it will be a clear demonstration to all people that Jesus is king, and he is basically acting in vengeance, punishment on Jerusalem, as he said would happen. And he's establishing his kingdom over all kingdoms, as yet one more kingdom of the earth falls to his judgment. So in that sense, he will be exalted. Now, I didn't put anything in here, Rick, about the elect being gathered, but I would say, in light of all of this, the elect being gathered in verse 27 is the other side of it, okay? The language of the sun being dark, that's the language of judgment. God is pouring out judgment on Jerusalem. The Son of Man is exalted, and God's people are made safe. God's people are going to be taken care of and protected, gathered, so to speak, out of the judgment, out of the destruction, and he will provide for them an escape and a protection. Okay? Let's see how we're doing here. We're behind. Imagine that. Yeah, go ahead. I do. I think we're still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay? So after saying all that, in verse 28, he says basically, as a fig tree starts to bear leaves and you know what's coming after that, okay, you know that summer is near, he says, recognize the signs that Jesus has given. Be watching for these things that I have described for you. Verse 29, when you see these things happening, recognizing that he is here. And I put the wrong verse there. Verse 30 is the verse that says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Okay? To me, this is a very helpful marker. Okay? I don't see any reason to think that from the beginning of the conversation to now, Jesus has changed subjects at all. He seems to have been talking about the same thing from verse 5 all the way to verse 30. And in verse 30 says, all these things are going to take place within the generation of those who are hearing me. Okay? So that's a helpful clue to say everything up to this point is going to be in the lifespan of this generation. Okay? And that would make sense if Jesus is talking about Jerusalem being destroyed by the Romans, which takes place, by the way, in the year 70 AD. So just maybe 40 years or so from when Jesus is saying all of these things. Okay? Now, there's some question about verse 31 and 32. Verse 31, an assurance of Jesus' words, says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Okay? Verse 32 says, of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. So one option is that in verse 31, Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away, and then follows that up by saying, of that day and hour no one knows, perhaps referring to the verse right before it, saying heaven and earth will pass away. When? No one knows but the Son or the Father. Okay? I think at this very moment, at 7:40 on November 1st, 2023, I lean towards saying he's still talking about destruction of Jerusalem. He's given them some signs to look for, but that's different than saying, you know the day and the hour. Okay? And he says, I can't tell you that, right? The two questions, when and what are the signs? I can give you some signs, but I can't tell you when, okay? I think that's the sense in which Jesus is speaking in verse 31 and verse 32. And so the main point would be, keep on the alert, okay? Don't get caught sleeping. He talks about a master returning. He talks about being awake could happen at any moment. So be prepared. Stay awake is the last word, literally, of the chapter, Mark chapter 13. Okay? So again, anyone in this room or out of this room is welcome to disagree with me. There are various ways, as we've said, of interpreting this chapter. So this is my interpretation, and we'll talk about in these last 4 minutes here some main points. Ryan? Yeah.
27, pretty well matches 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, which is describing the second coming of Christ and the gathering of the saints, at least at a minimum, since we can't be 100% certain, is not that this is the end of the world, a possible or legitimate alternative interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to get around verse 30, saying this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. But I do want to return, so I'm glad you mentioned that. I want to return to something you said earlier, which is that regardless of what exactly Jesus is talking about at what point in this chapter, whether destruction of Jerusalem or the kind of the final judgment, you said earlier that the destruction of Jerusalem is a prefiguring of that final judgment and Jesus' ultimate return. So it's not that it doesn't matter, but even if you see it as the destruction of Jerusalem all the way through, what lesson do we learn from this? Well, the lesson we learn is there's a judgment coming for us too. And a lot of these, or all of these same principles apply about, how spectacular it will be or horrifying for those who are not in Christ, or the suddenness of it, and be awake, and all that stuff applies to what we have in front of us, which is the second coming. So even if you see it as I do, all this is just about the destruction of Jerusalem, that doesn't take away its relevance and its power for us. Larson, taking you 6 weeks to make a comment in Bible class, man. Come on.
Quotes from Joel 2 that uses very similar language about the sun being darkened and the moon turning to blood. And that's not really a judgment scene,
Sure.
in as much as it's a cosmic change of things.
Yeah.
And I think that all of those situations, those grand moments of the cosmos, of the universe being turned upside down, judgment days would be that. But the first day of the grand offer of salvation in Christ would be a day like that. And so I like that idea of what God does is always a preview of what's coming, but it gets greater and greater. So we might think of or Jesus teaches that the day of judgment in Jerusalem would be a day of cosmic change. Not as much as the final one will be, right? So it's always a preview, and it's getting greater and greater as we look forward.
Thank you, Larson. Okay, I do want to throw this in here. That's what Jesus said about the destruction of Jerusalem. And I just want you to see how, and this is going to be very basic, very general here. When these things actually happen, I want you to notice how it happens. In the year 66 AD, the Jews, who were always discontent, you might remember that, with the Romans ruling over them, the Jews finally decided to revolt around the year 66 AD, okay? So for a few years then, there are wars between the Jews and the Romans, and they're going back and forth. And the Jews are surprisingly successful in these wars, which only builds their kind of self-confidence of, hey, we can actually overthrow the Romans, right? General Vespasian is the leader of the Roman forces in Judea, and they have these wars going on, okay? But in 69 AD, okay, as Vespasian is getting closer to ending this thing, in 69 AD, he's called back to Rome because he's proclaimed emperor. And that puts a brief hiatus on the action in Judea, okay? The next year then, Vespasian's son Titus comes and he finishes the job. Puts a siege around Jerusalem, chokes them out for about 5 months, and then utterly destroys the city, okay? And think about how that happens, and what we're told by later Christian writers is that with that little break, with that Vespasian being called away, hiatus before the besieging and destruction, that's when the Christians got out, okay? Using, presumably, Jesus' words, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, get out of the city. They did that, and I don't know, all of them, every single one, but the ones that got out, obviously were saved from that. And this is what they were saved from. Well, go read this. It's horrible. It's like, streets are running with blood. He says at the end, there's so much blood running in the streets that it put out the fires of the houses that were burning. Maybe an exaggeration there on Josephus' part, but that's what he says, okay? Again, as we've already said, really the message is for us what it was for them. Jesus brings judgment because he's king, and so he brings vengeance on all those who do not obey that announcement that he is king. And for us, we need to stay awake. Not worried about the signs of the end times, but instead worrying about doing our part to proclaim the gospel in the whole world and anticipating the return of Jesus when he comes back. Okay, on to Mark 14 next week. Thank you, everybody.